In 1774 then, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts designed to punish Boston for the Tea Party. And of the most serious punishments, they shut down and dissolved their assembly, their local government. At the same time, by coincidence, and this was not connected, but at the same time they passed another act that had nothing to do with taxes or the Tea Party or any of that stuff, but it had to do with the land in the West. And as I said, when England acquired that land, they were very afraid that they were going to have a lot of problems with Indians. And they haven't. And so they've decided, well, you know what? We can now allow settlement west of the Appalachians. Only in the Northwest. They only limited it to the area north of the Ohio River. So you'll need to check the map in your book. There's this area of the Northwest. It's from the Appalachians on the east to the Great Lakes on the north, to the Mississippi on the west, to the Ohio River on the south. And in that northwest area, they're now going to allow settlement to open up. And so they put all of that land under the jurisdiction of one of the colonial assemblies. And sometimes I like to have fun with students trying to guess which colony it was. The obvious one would be Virginia, because that was one that claimed all of that land. A couple of other colonies claimed some of that land, so there would have been a problem of Virginia claiming it and then Massachusetts claiming the same some places, and so it's complicated. But England passed in 1774, of all things, the Quebec Act, which gave that land to Quebec, which is not even one of the traditional colonies, not even one of the 13 original colonies. It's a new colony that England had set up in 1763 when they acquired Canada from France. It's the colony for the Canadian part that England had gotten up there, and they set up a colony there called Quebec. And so it's a new colony, but it's a little bit different from the others because it's French. The people who live there are mostly French, and so they're Catholic. And so England had said that Quebec would have Catholicism as its official religion. They're trying to be decent and respect that if they try to establish the Anglican Church in Quebec, they're going to have lots of problems, so they just said Quebec could be Catholic. And since the French had never had assemblies, the way that France ran its empire, they don't have assemblies. So there's no assembly for Quebec. So this is the one colony that gets all the land in the West. And it's Catholic, which most Americans don't really care about. Most Americans are pretty tolerant in religion, but there's still some of the old-time Puritans in New England who still are very hostile to Catholics and still see all sorts of Catholic plots against them and everything. And so they're very bitter about the fact that it's a Catholic colony and there's no assembly. So although the Quebec Act is really separate from the Coercive Acts, Americans see a connection. They see the fact that the one colony that got all of that land in the West is the one colony that does not have an assembly, at the same time that they're taking away the assembly of Massachusetts, which they've had since 1630. I mean, that's been a part of life in Massachusetts from the very beginning. So Americans see a new British policy in the making, but one that does not include assemblies, one that does not include self-government, one that does not include this basic feature of British liberty in America, the right to control your own government through your own election, through your own assembly. So Americans lump the Coercive Acts and the Quebec Act together, and they call it the Intolerable Acts. and they decide we're going to have to do something about it. Now the they that I'm talking about here are the assemblies. The assemblies are in communication with one another. They are, as I said, they've been communicating over the Stamp Act. They communicated to call the Stamp Act Congress. They've been communicating to try to implement boycotts, to work out the details of the boycotts that they'd had against the Stamp Act and then later against the Townsend duties. So Americans are working together through rather informal and just off the board associations or communication networks that they are in touch with each other. And through those networks they said, let's have another Congress to decide how we're going to deal with these so-called intolerable acts, the Quebec Act and the coercive acts taken together. So the networking goes out, the news goes around through the very primitive and informal communication network that we're going to have a Congress and we're going to meet in Philadelphia this time, and we're just going to discuss what we're going to do about the intolerable acts. And we want to work together. We don't want to have each colony trying to handle this by itself. We want to act together, so we present a united front to Parliament and to English authorities. So it's called the Continental Congress. The Continental, because it's going to represent the colonies of the continent as opposed to those down in the Caribbean. 12 colonies sent delegates to this one. The one that I think did not was Georgia. And again, it was just because of problems of communication and getting the news out and trying to get the assembly to meet and elect delegates. But each assembly met and chose half a dozen or so people to go to Philadelphia as their spokespeople to present their argument and to figure out what to do and to talk with the other colonies. So they met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1774. And they really couldn't decide on a single course of action. They couldn't come up with a set of resolutions they did at the Stamp Act. This is the second time they've had a Congress. And the Stamp Act Congress adopted the Stamp Act resolves. They couldn't really do that in the Continental Congress because there was such a disagreement among the Americans about how to go. And it's kind of complicated, and there are a lot of delegates there, and you'd have to look at each delegate, but just to simplify it, you can say, well, there's sort of the radicals and the conservatives. The conservatives are still saying, hey, we're British subjects. We love our king. We have all these rights. What we need to do is somehow to convince Parliament to come back into the good old days of salutary neglect. Let's show that we're loyal to the king and that all we want is what we've always had. You know, you're taking away from us rights that we think we should have, and we just want you to accept that, and so we can go back and be back in the good old days where everybody just sort of got along, and you didn't bother us, and we just had salutary neglect, and we respected you, and everybody was happy. So there were those who said we should try to figure out some way to get back to the good old days. But there were increasingly radicals who have been following, the lead of people like Sam Adams, who a long time before had said, we have to become independent. Many more Americans have come to the idea that England is never going to respect our rights. They're never going to leave us alone. They're never going to go back to salutary neglect. They're never going to let our assemblies just run ourselves the way we always had. The only thing we can do is to go forward, and that means going towards independence. Now, there's a lot of people sort of in between those two extremes. So people are all over. It's like there's one extreme of the radical on the left and the conservatives on the right who are saying, they're all different places in between. And so they couldn't come up with anything in between. But what they did was adopt, and they agreed to adopt what were called the Suffolk Resolves. The Suffolk Resolves, which will be you can access that with the notes. The town of Suffolk in Massachusetts had been meeting illegally. Local assemblies, remember, local government had been dissolved, but people were still doing it. The traditional town council or whatever had adopted a set of resolves, presented it to the assembly, which again was meeting illegally. There was a famous meeting when they were meeting, and the governor found out, and he said they can't be meeting, it's against the law. And so he sent some people over to tell them that they have to go home. And these two representatives from the governor's office went and knocked on the door where the assembly was meeting, and the assembly just ignored them. They locked the door and they wouldn't let them in. They just went on meeting, and they're, you know, in violation of law, but they're doing it. And so the Massachusetts Assembly had approved these Suffolk resolves, and so they sent delegates to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress along with everybody else, and they presented them there. And in a secret session, the Congress adopted the Suffolk resolves. And what they said was, we should be prepared for the possibility that the English redcoats are going to attack and shut down our assemblies. We need to be ready to respond militarily to a potential military threat. The English are so committed to taking away our rights, our freedoms, especially our self-government, that we have to be prepared to defend ourselves with violence if necessary. So it recommended that militias throughout the colonies start preparing to be ready in case they have to defend themselves against a British attack. So those resolutions are adopted in secret, and the news goes out through the various colonies to the various militias, all in secret, to start preparing for the potential of an armed attack. And it's very inconsistent as what goes on. I mean, some places did a lot, every place is a little bit different. Some of the assemblies were very active and others were kind of nonchalant about the whole deal. It's a very uneven response to the resolves. But as you might expect, the most active enforcement of that and the most active efforts to be prepared were in Boston, no secret, in Massachusetts. The assembly, the militia started organizing. People would bring ammunition into some central warehouse. One of the local members would say, use my barn as a kind of a warehouse for ammunition and everything. And Sam Adams actually has left the city of Boston because the British were after him. He figured correctly that if they caught him, they'd arrest him and take him to England and convict him. So he's out organizing the militia, and they're making plans for what they're going to do in case an attack materializes. And they've got some very elaborate plans. You know, it's like where Farmer A says, well, you know, if I find out that the British or the army is out to attack us, if the redcoats are out to attack us, I'll tell Farmer B and C and D, and B says I'll tell Farmer C, E, and my neighbors here and here. And they're working out these networks, they're working out this whole plan of a possible response to an attack. And they've got a very elaborate plan. A whole bunch of people are meeting together and they're preparing for war. Part of the plan was in the city of Boston itself, that the people there, the people who are organizing this, will send a message out to the country letting them know if the British are actually moving to attack, if the army. And one of the people who's involved in that is a name that I told you before, Paul Revere. He's been active in the sort of the radical group since the days of the Boston Massacre. He was the guy who drew that etching that's in your book that falsely portrays what happened in the Boston Massacre. He's part of it. His job is that if he finds out from somebody else that the British Army is moving, he's going to tell the sexton, which is the caretaker of Old North Church in Boston, that this is happening. Now, Old North Church was the largest church in Boston, but ironically, in Puritan Boston, it was an Anglican church. most of its members were loyal Anglicans, which kind of meant that, you know, if they're part of the Church of England, they tended to be more conservative. So within Boston, there are a lot of people who are conservatives, who are not involved in this radical movement, and many of them are members of the Old North Church. But the person they hire, the sexton to hire to keep track of it, is actually working with the radicals. And so the plan is that if he gets the word that he's going to go up into the steeple of the church and put up lanterns warning that the army is on the move, and the question was whether they would go, it's a little hard to describe this without a map, but one possibility is that they'd go across the Charles River and then go by land, or go by sea. They would go out to the water and use the river to cross and get closer to where they're going to go. The other option would be they would go around by land, but it would be further, but then they wouldn't have to deal with crossing the river. And where they're going to be headed is to two towns up sort of north and west of Boston, the town of Lexington and the town of Concord, because those are two towns where the militias have been really storing up weapons. They've been storing up munitions and putting them all together and trying to get more to have ready, and they've actually gotten a couple of cannons to be there too, that they stole from the British Army. So those are two places that are really going to be the target. And all of this work, remember, is being done in secret. But it was impossible to keep it secret. I mean, a lot of people in the community were very conservative, were very loyal to the king. There were, you know, scattered throughout the towns where it's mixed. Probably in some towns there's a lot of radicals. In other towns it's mostly conservative. It's all mixed. But some of the conservatives have seen what's going on. And yeah, they're trying to do this all secretly. Well, you can't keep that a secret. You can't not let people know what's going on. I mean, people can see, other people can see. And they've been reporting to the British governor, who is actually a general. His name is Gage, General Gage. He's the governor. They've been reporting to him what's going on out there in the countryside. So he knows about this. And on the night of April 18th, he decides to go out, to take some troops, and go find some of that supplies that they're stashing away and destroy it. Paul Revere reported, he described later what happened. He said, "A woman came to me from Dr. Warren." Now, Dr. Warren was one of the leaders of the radical group. He's a young guy, a young widower there. And he was having an affair with Mrs. Gage, the wife of the governor. She was sleeping with some guy that was working with the radicals and is part of it. So she came to Paul Revere and said, the troops have gotten up and they're going to go across the river. So he went down to the church, told the sexton, and the sexton put up 2 lanterns indicating that the British Army was coming and that they were going to come by the water route. So 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Well, it's a famous poem, but it isn't that Paul Revere saw it. He gave the directions to put up the lanterns and put up the warnings. The warnings got out. People started mobilizing as per plan. Paul Revere himself went across the river. He got on the other side and he borrowed a horse from a friend, and he went out, but the British Army arrested him, and so he wasn't able to do anything else. But the word had gotten out. The militias started to mobilize. The British Army got to Lexington. They were fired upon. People were killed. They went on to Concord, and a very serious battle took place. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. This was the beginning of the war.